So let's move straight on to our next session, which is raiding the archive, in which we have three speakers, Keith Piper, Courtney Martin and Angeli Dallard-Clayton, that will address this question of the archive. And just very quickly, Stuart Hall reminds us that the construction of a living archive, and I think this is what we're in the process of doing, engaging as a living archive, must be seen as an ongoing, never completed project. And I think that's just something that we are conscious of participating as we move forward. So Keith Piper I'll ask Keith to come up and give his presentation, which will be a talk and a film. I won't go through bios at this point. You can see the biographies here. I'm sure, as we all know, I don't think we need to.
It is neither a talk or a film. It's a brief intro, and what I will describe as an e-paper. If this thing ever comes back to life.
You need to get this on laptop, is it?
Don't talk about supported listening. Not available.
Should I turn the lights off?
Yes, you can do. No idea. That's right. Okay, I'd like to kind of thank everyone for coming, especially just ask them quickly to kind of thank all of the individuals involved in the organisation of this event, and especially to my colleagues Marlene Smith, without whom this event would not have been possible, driving force, and Claudette, of course, and also to Sonia Boyce and to Paul for kind of entering the project at a key stage and really giving it shape and form. And what I'm going to do, firstly, I really need to also say that Kerbina's talk. I mean, we have just witnessed the kind of state of the art in terms of an ability to closely describe the art object. I just wanted to kind of really thank him for that, and kind of thank him in the context also of the kind of unfolding nature of this whole project, the Blk Art Group Research Project. And in that respect, I just wanted to kind of draw folks' attention back to the symposium, which we held the 22nd of February in Sheffield. And in approaching that symposium, we were absolutely aware that in that moment of the early 80s, we spoke about many things, but in terms of a conversation about the work itself, about the art object, about our ability to describe what we were actually doing, that to a large extent was missing. And so in a sense of kind of going back to that moment, what we really wanted to kind of do was to start to describe the objects themselves, to kind of start a conversation about the work. And very much the symposium, it in effect, was about that. Although in that symposium, they also thought that it was important to kind of have a sort of brief section which reminded us of the framing of that moment. What was it about the early 80s which was specific and particular and gave rise to all these types of practice? And in order to understand that, you have to attempt to go back in a kind of really cursory way and look at the history. And so in a section at the start of that day, we devised this sort of whistle-stop historical contextualization of that moment. And what I intend to show here is not the piece in progress which I showed then, which is a longer piece which kind of goes back, looks at the moment of 1976 and the Notting Hill riot, as a pivotal nodal element in the development of a particular kind of black presence, and the way that then influenced what happened in the 80s. What all I'm going to do here is actually start halfway through the piece which was shown in February, at the moment of 1981, to just come, at 81, and just attempt to kind of use some of the archival fragments of that time to begin to remind ourselves or to construct a kind of narrative about that moment. And within that narrative, you can then begin to kind of place these art practices. And what all I've done there, and I'm here, is continue that, but also attempted to kind of bring into that a sort of case study of the kinds of ideas and activities of the Blk Art Group through looking at the archive as it exists. And I'm really, really happy that has some give this kind of close read on the work itself, because this is completely absent in here. Then what I'm looking at is the printed materials, the posters, the exhibition catalogues, just as a kind of case study within a wider context. So I'll just get into that. What I really need to apologise about, though, is the sound quality of this. The sound quality is terrible, and it gets worse as it goes through. And I'm blaming Trevor Mathewson and my other technical friends, because because these guys have microphones, they have everything. Did they lend me one? So anyway, okay, so this is part 2. It starts about 81. Oh.
1981 began in a moment of trauma. These are the opening frames from Franco Rosso's seminal film, Babylon. In the background of the shot, we see a row of houses stretching along New Cross Road, southeast London. It was in one of these houses, number 439, that in the small hours of Sunday the 18th of January 1981, 13 young black people died in a to-date unexplained fire. Ignored evidence of a racist motive for this atrocity, alongside press and governmental indifference, led to an escalation of anger within London's black communities. This led to the organisation of a Black People's Day of Action on the 2nd of March 1981. The occasion saw between 10 and 25,000 people march 17 miles from Fordham Park, New Cross, through southeast London, crossing the river at Blackfriars, into the heart of the city with its symbolic fortresses of privilege and power, past the Houses of Parliament for a final rally in Hyde Park. The march was largely peaceful, but seemingly seen by the state to represent a territorial violation, an insurgent act of mass trespass by people who had forgotten their place. Key to the organisation of the Black People's Day of Action were members of the Brixton-based Race the Day collective, and in the weeks that followed the march, the police sought to reverse their sense of territorial violation by launching preemptive raids on the collective's headquarters, situated on Brixton's front line, Railton Road. And if these acts of territorial reassertion into the perceived heart of the black community were not enough, in April, the Metropolitan Police decided to launch the aptly named Swamp 81, an almost military operation in which 120 plainclothes officers descended on Brixton, using the provocative sus laws, a resuscitation of the Vagrancy Act of 1824, to stop and search 943 people over a 5-day period. During the early evening of Friday the 10th of April 1981, Brixton exploded in an uprising which lasted for 3 days. On the 14th of April, Home Secretary Willie Whitelaw called upon the learned Judge Lord Scarman to hold an inquiry. Its terms of reference: to inquire urgently into the serious disorder in Brixton on the 10th to 12th of April 1981, and to report with the power to make recommendations. But, as Scarman deliberated, a long hot summer of urban uprisings kicked into gear. During the opening weeks of July 1981, Toxteth, Handsworth, Chapeltown, Southall, Moss Side, Nottingham, Wolverhampton, Sheffield, Derby, Hull, Maidstone, Aldershot, Preston, Ellesmere Port, and other sites of urban decay witnessed uprisings resembling riots, in which marginalised youth across race vented their frustrations against the state which had rendered them surplus. On November the 25th, 1981, the Scarman Report was published. Heavily influenced by the findings of the Kerner Commission set up by Lyndon Baines Johnson in the wake of the 1967 US race riots, a number of Scarman's key findings could be seen to subtly nudge sections of the national discourse around the management of racial difference onto a new trajectory. One, which despite being part throttled at birth and part deformed during its infancy by the grinding hostilities of rampant Thatcherism, has arguably gone on to give the British model of what has come to be described as multiculturalism its particular set of inflections, possibilities and contradictions. Although, as highlighted in the 1999 Macpherson report, which scrutinised police responses to the death of Stephen Lawrence, many of Scarman's key recommendations around policing were ignored, it is in the realm of social policy that Scarman's influence was to have arguably more resonance. In common with Kerner, Scarman tacitly recognises that the state's ability to continuously suppress, contain and pacify black communities through an aggressive colonial model of policing alone was unsustainable, and that the carrot of promised social mobility had to be added to the stick of aggressive containment in order to manage the social and political volatility of certain communities. The impact which Scarmanism had on public culture and the arts is complex and nuanced. Policies of targeted inclusion on the part of left-wing local authorities and liberal arts organisations were given enhanced focus in the wake of Scarman. During the early to mid-1980s, therefore, formerly excluded and marginalised cultural and creative activities surged through the institutional cracks into view, even whilst those institutions were being systematically bulldozed by Thatcher and her henchmen. It was into this complex and shifting landscape that a generation of artists, artist collectives, filmmakers and workshops, poets, writers, and other creative practitioners began to percolate and interrelate, and the complex, multi-layered, and sometimes contradictory narrative of what is sometimes described as the British Black Arts movement of the 1980s begins to be written. What follows is a brief examination of some of the activities of a small clustering of young visual artists who were active from the start of the decade until 1984 and came to be known as the Blk Art Group. In rereading the activities and positions of this group, the fact that it was exclusively comprised of children of Caribbean migrants, raised and located in the fading industrial landscapes of the Midlands and the North during the 1970s, could be seen as playing a formative role in the particular positions, both political and aesthetic, which the group became most associated with. Brought together initially as a group of friends and peers of the young Wolverhampton-based artist Eddie Chambers, pictured here in 1980 by the photographer John Reardon in front of his seminal work, The Destruction of the National Front, and supported by local community activist Eric Pembleton, the group was first assembled as Wolverhampton Young Black Artists to stage an exhibition at the city's art gallery in June 1981. The title of the exhibition, Black Art and Done, emerged from a prolonged conversation during which potential titles, including the Pan-African Connection, were discussed and rejected, to the point that, in exasperation, somebody suggested that the show just be called Black Art. The response to this suggestion was the colloquial exclamation, "You mean just call it black art and done?" Roughly translated, black art, full stop. The title stuck. Little did this group of 20-year-olds realise that the term black art, far from being done as a definitive and closed marker, would become one of the most contentious and slippery of terms, marking and to some degree distorting creative discourses over the coming decade, arguably to the point of exhaustion, around what black art might be, who could make it, and where its parameters might lie. The all-male lineup of this show could be seen as establishing an early impression of the group as being synonymous with the predominantly masculinized form of address. However, it should be noted that as members of the original lineup, Andrew Hazel, Ian Palmer, and finally Dominic Dawes fell away, they were replaced almost exclusively by female artists. By the time of the group's second show at the Africa Centre, Covent Garden, in June 1982, Claudette Johnson and Wendell Leslie had joined the group. Janet Vernon appears in the lineup for the show a month later at the Icon Gallery, Birmingham, and Marlene Smith was to join, along with Donald Rodney, soon after that. The exhibitions of the summer of 1982 are also marked by the adoption of the title The Pan-African Connection, a use of terminology first defined by group mentor Eric Pemberton in his introduction to the Africa Centre exhibition handout. In it, he clearly identifies the young artist as located within a diasporic reimagining of Africanness, particular to a Caribbean political narrative marked by the dispersions of the Middle Passage, and links this directly with an African-American sensibility through evoking the memory of Martin Luther King. This figuring of Pan-Africanism runs parallel to Eddie Chambers' aspirations around what he proclaimed as art for Uhuru, a re-evoking of the Swahili term for freedom, which had gained traction in the 1970s through figures such as African-American cultural nationalist Ron Karenga. In his text for the Africa Centre, Chambers lays out his aspirations for a socially engaged mode of practice, functioning beyond the wreckage left by centuries of racial terror, to, in his words, strengthen the blacks that remain. Also running parallel to this, in the same exhibition guide, Claudette Johnson begins to expound an equally radical discourse which chooses to evoke the gendered body as a key site of struggle and re-employs lines from Gail Murray's poem of 1970, "I have my own business in this skin and on this planet." The conversation between these two radical forms of address provided a bubbling subtext during the preparation for the group's next major project, already signposted by Chambers in the Africa Centre leaflet. These were plans to stage a black art convention in October of that year in the Faculty of Art and Design of the Polytechnic, Wolverhampton. The first National Black Art Convention was created as a targeted call to black artists and art students to gather on the 28th of October 1982 in order to discuss the form, functioning and future of something called black art. The event was chaired by Eric Pemberton and group member Janet Vernon, and featured presentations from figures such as Rashid Areen, artist and founder of Black Phoenix and later Third Text, Shaka Dedi, who would go on to found the Black Art Gallery in Finsbury Park, London in 1983, group member Claudette Johnson, and others. Also present were artists such as Frank Bolin, Lubena Himid, Sonia Boyce, members of the Black Audio Film Collective, Anna Mayapple, and others amongst the vocal and engaged audience. The audio record and other archival fragments of this complex, multi-voiced event are now beginning to enter the public domain, and detailed analysis of the day will form the subject of other investigations. However, in the years which followed the event, it came to figure as a watershed moment in which some of the key players and debates which marked the decade, especially around issues such as gender, first overlapped, entered into coalition, and in some instances clashed. However, what interests me here is an examination of the archival record of the impressions of the event which members of the Black Art Group came away with, and how that shaped events which followed. In a handwritten note, Eddie Chambers refers to what he sees as the shortcomings and failures of previous seminars and discussion groups, and makes it clear that he is referring to our own first National Black Art Convention. This frustration, I would argue, centred around the unresolvable arguments generated by the assertion that artists could or should be corralled into a single category which at times seemed to be defined by nothing more than skin colour, and paid little attention to the vast diversity of creative, conceptual and aesthetic fascinations which fuel the work of artists of colour, from the most esoteric to the most politically strident. Therefore, the impossibility of consensus across such an arbitrarily defined grouping, for which in many cases the declaration that black art must represented an archaic and absurd imposition, began to suggest that a new category of practice was needed, one which could be defined more around the intentionality of the artist, and a shared consensus around the political and societal role of their practice. To this end, a second convention, this time using the prefix radical, to signal a new holistic category of radical black art, was planned for March 1984 at the Ukaidi Centre, Nottingham. In the pre-publicity to this event, an attempt was made to set the parameters of the conversation in advance by signalling that the idea behind this convention is to provide a forum within which those already committed to the view that black art must aim to raise the consciousness of black people can meet together in order to analyse the problems concerned with and work in solutions necessary to ensure the fulfilment of this aim. Furthermore, the programme declared that this convention would provide an opportunity for those actively involved in the production of radical black art to meet together to discuss the form, function and future of their work. And in the preamble, words lifted from Chambers' text bemoaning the shortcomings of the first National Black Art Convention were reproduced almost verbatim. However, in the event, this conference was characterised by frustration and a distinct lack of anything approaching useful consensus. In retrospect, I would argue that this can be traced in part to the surfacing of a bubbling schism which has come to emerge and re-emerge during key developmental moments of black radical thought in the West. The uneasy cohabitation of ideas informed by what could be described as a progressive libertarian socialism and ideas informed by a radical Afrocentric cultural nationalism, which, although at some levels can coexist as tolerant bedfellows, will begin to shred and splinter when more complex and focused directions are contemplated. This was true within the violent schism which developed between Ron Karenga's US organisation and the Black Panther Party in 1969 in Los Angeles, and in a wholly more genteel and parochial way, it became true of the irritable disagreements around creative practice which took place in a provincial community centre in Nottingham in 1984. In the space between the first National Black Art Convention in October 1982 and the Radical Black Art Convention in Nottingham of March 1984, a number of group shows were staged, which, in their turn, reflected the evolving practice of each artist within the group's shifting lineup. These projects included the Midland Group Nottingham in January 1983, and the following month, the Herbert Art Gallery in Coventry. In this instance, a wave of press controversy whipped up around my canvas-based piece of 1982, Another Nigger Died Today, led to an adults-only ruling for parts of the show, as well as an assortment of press responses to the exhibition as a whole, ranging from the reactionary to the reflective, informed and well-considered. May-June of that year saw the second show staged at the Africa Centre, which, along with featuring a much reduced lineup, was also the final time that this group showed work together under the title The Pan-African Connection. In part, following the frustrations of the Nottingham Convention of 1984, members of the group dispersed to become part of a wider movement of black artists emerging through a number of collective shows and solo projects through the mid-1980s. These projects began, at their most interesting, to see an evolving away from the collectivizing language of political absolutes into more complex, inflective, gendered, embodied and intimate modes of address in response to, and perhaps in some instances in retreat from, the increasingly unstable and contorted political landscape of the mid-1980s. It was a landscape in which nothing and everything was changing. The uprisings of 1985, sparked by the shootings of Cherry Gross in Brixton, the death of Cynthia Jarrett in Tottenham, and continued police brutality in Handsworth, reminded us that little had changed since 1981 beyond the level and sophistication of the special weapons and tactics which the police were prepared to unleash against urban communities. What perhaps had changed was that we had also seen the police unleash similar tactics against striking miners, and during the following year, against striking print workers outside the News International plant in Wapping. This reminded us that in Thatcher's Britain, progress towards racial equality was coming to mean that state violence which had been honed against black people at home and Irish Republicans abroad was now being meted out to members of the domestic white working class. As artists continue to grapple with these continuities and shifts at home, they're also confronted with the complexities of imagery circulating from abroad, ranging from the paternalism of Band-Aid in the wake of the famine in Ethiopia in 1984 to the accelerating but at times disturbingly fratricidal struggles against apartheid in South Africa. It could be argued that these images made established rhetorics of political certainty less sustainable, and more complex and multivalent discourses needed to emerge in order to describe black diasporic identities in the UK in relationship to the historical, the global, and the local. I would argue that most notably, Paul Gilroy, in his 1987 text, There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack, begins to articulate the complex, contested pathways towards the emergence of a black Britishness. Unlike the Tory injunction on their electoral poster of 1983, which instructs black people to fully adopt the established aesthetics of pre-existing Britishness as mutually exclusive of blackness, Gilroy sought to articulate a pathway through which the very idea of Britishness was itself being modified and transformed by and through the activities and presence of multiple diasporic peoples. In stark opposition to Thatcher's characterization of black people as swamping Britishness, Gilroy would move to cite art practices as disparate as Sonia Boyce's She Ain't Holding Them Up, She's Holding On, Some English Rose of 1986, to Smiley Culture's satirical commentary on race, identity and linguistics of 1984, Cockney Translation, to argue for a radical reconfiguration of the idea of black Britishness. Specifically, within Cockney Translation, although the piece initially posits blackness and cockneyness as mutually exclusive, it does begin to imagine some type of shared category within which a black cockneyness could potentially emerge. It is through these and other means that I would argue that towards the end of the 1980s, the potential to navigate pathways towards a complex understanding of black Britishness evolving from a multi-layered interlocking of personal, local, national and international diasporic identities within the framework of a new international modernity begins to fully emerge.
Okay, that's that. I don't know if we can do questions now or just ask. What does come next?
What we'll do is a couple of questions. Take a couple of questions. Where's my mic? Okay. Okay, we're going to have a couple of questions in response to that. Fantastic presentation by Keith. I think Shaheen wanted to ask a question, so can I get the mic over that side, please? Thank you. And then if you raise your hands, and then over here.
Again, thank you very much to both the speakers. And the amount of information which has been place in front of us maybe suggests that this maybe is not the right way to organize this. There's so much to consider that it really suggests a workshop where we can actually interact with this much more.
The workshops will come.
That's just a feeling I have because there's so much going on, honestly. It's dense, it's as dense as it gets. But I'm thankful for that. And I'd like to bring the two, a suggestion that there might be something between the two which I'd like to try and bring together here, if you don't mind.
As long as there's a question.
Yeah.
All right,
It doesn't look like a question. Look, they might have notes.
This is my mean face now.
They might have notes and everything. That's not a question.
I felt what Kobina suggested about the last models, about the fact that Arayan, Richard Arayan, David Mandela and other people have not been placed within the archive. There isn't a place for us to go there. Comes up again in the way that Keith talks about the fact that there hasn't been space within which we can contemplate what has happened for us to be able to then leave aside or create a space within which to work through this material. And it takes a space like this to bring it together. And it's not part of either academic or structures or narratives within which we can function. And I'm just wondering, after all this periods of time, with all of these efforts, it still seems to be invisible. And it maintains its invisibility throughout the larger structure, which we call the canon. How and when and what are the possibilities of all of this material finding its rightful place is actually going to occur? Because I still don't see it.
So, okay, that question I think we're going to deal with in the plenary.
But
Absolutely.
I'm just wondering if Keith...
Yeah, exactly. So before I ask Keith to respond, can we have one more question?
Yeah.
So just wait for the mic to come.
Can I just quickly respond to Shaheen's point? Because I think I would hope that events like this are part of the start of that process. And the fact that this event is a part of an attempt to kind of launch what is a research project. What is a research project which can begin to, primarily within a sort of academic setting, to begin to kind of house those debates, those points of inquiry. And obviously, yes, it is absent now, but it's a thing which, we are all in the process of attempting to construct. I think that's what we're doing.
Okay.
I just want to say thank you. I'm really pleased to be able to be here. And I suppose my question is two things. One,
Can I interrupt you 1 second? Can everybody, when you pick up the mic to ask the question, can you just say who you are?
I'll say my name again then. My name is Jenny Arboy, and I'm really grateful to be here. I think it's really important. The invisibility and strawberries are what I want to bring together. Because in the first speech there was about the rhizomes. I have an allotment and my strawberries just go wild. And it's amazing the path they take. But also they can become invisible among higher plants. And one of the things that happens within black arts is that a lot of people who contribute small things, big things, who are self-taught tend to become invisible. And it's absolutely imperative that whoever does whatever archive that saw, or else it will become permanently invisible. And I think it's about the little small strawberries going out there that need to be tacked into the archive. That's the question.
Well, that raises a really interesting point about the nature of archives, because something can only be in an archive if it exists in some form. And one of the things which you realise when you actually look at a time like the early 80s is that a lot of stuff only now exists in our recollection. There is no physical document about it. And in a sense, when we consider archives, we have to, it is actually about that act of what are the things, and how do we then respond to those things which were made in that moment, in this moment.
I mean, guys, do you have a question? Just help here, so Could you keep your hands raised when you answer a question so we can find it? A quick question, please.
I'm drinking all the water. I don't have a question actually, but just to say, the point of
Someone who's got a question. Come here.
Rhizomatic is a really important thing. So perhaps the question relates to that, and also in terms of the archive. I think it is a really, important juncture. The archive does exist in various people's private homes, etc., etc. So all of that has to come together, and for those of us who had faith, we have kept those letters, we have kept those correspondences and postcards and slide images. But then it raises another issue, which is not very long ago, the African and Asian artists' slide library, visual archive, was nearly thrown out. So, these are things, in terms of, Keith, your presentation today, the visual archive of these historical moments are so critical, whether they are the points, the rhizomatic strawberries that emerge in lonely fields, wherever they might be, but they are there. And I think the question of the rhizomatic is absolutely critical.
Okay. So we have.
I think that's an essential point.
A question at the top. Perhaps Keith, do you want to address that while we take the mic up for the final question?
Well, it's just a response to that. Yes, you are absolutely right. That a lot of stuff exists in people's houses, in people's own archive, and it's about how we then can really begin to kind of connect all those things together. I suppose we are in a moment when increasingly we have the tools to kind of do that, just in terms of the way the kind of internet is used and the way that we can all share information through those means.
And presumably the Blk Art Group Research Project is one vehicle to...
It's one vehicle, but there should be many.
Can we have the question, please?
Oh, hi, my name's Dorothea Smart. Hello, poet, live artist. And my question is, it's for Kavina as well, really. Just wanted to ask them both to say something about other influences in that era that would have impacted on people's practice. Because I'm aware, and we're aware that the way that black is defined in the US context is very different, in my experience of that time anyway, of how it was used in the UK context and in a socialist context and internationalist context, and it wasn't just about skin colour, so there was other groups of people, Irish, Asian, whatever, who were included in that, and, not all Caribbeans are African ancestry.
Mm-hmm.
And so, how might that inform?
So opening that question of what is black into a wider perspective, is that what you're...
No, but that question was there in the 80s.
Right.
So there are people who were practicing as
Absolutely.
black artists who were not people of African ancestry.
Mm-hmm.
So how might that have informed some of the things that
Sure.
Kavina and Keats
Sure.
that painting of that time? Because by referring to the African American model,
Mm-hmm.
you're narrowing black down to that,
Mm-hmm.
and in the British context,
It's much more political,
Just
yeah.
that, yeah.
Keith, you want to respond to that?
Well, I think it is actually something which one has to examine in relationship to specific pieces of work and specific moments and specific artists. Because I think that at any given time, there were a whole range of influences and a whole range of ways in which debates were framed. And that's why it becomes so important to actually stop at the actual art object itself and say, what are the influences for this piece of work which was made at this moment? It actually may not be the same as a piece of work made by that artist in the following year, because those influences have shifted, changed, their ideas have evolved. And that's why it is so important to kind of start at the object itself.
Okay. Sonia, very quickly.
Thanks. Hi, my name's Sonny Boyce. Following on from Dorothea's question, one of the things that I often thought about in terms of the Wolverhampton Conference in 1982 was how the Blk Art Group came into contact with Rashid and asked him to be one of the central speakers of the conference. He spoke quite early.
Yeah, he was the first speaker, yes.
And I just, in terms of that question, I wondered, you know, how that relationship was forged.
I mean, Courtney's paper that's a great link actually, Courtney's paper, which will deal with that. But did you want to quickly respond to that? Or
No, I can't, because I don't know how that was formed.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank Keith for his presentation.